Okay. So, as you probably know, Brazil is going on a conservative coup d'etat that has been bulldozing the programs and the institutions that allowed anthropologists and other social scientists to be public intellectuals in the recent past. So this is part of the background of the things I will talk about. Now, what's the challenge of indigenous anthropologies? Well, as part of programs of extending formal education to indigenous communities, we have a generation of individuals from the indigenous peoples in Brazil that got to their PhDs in anthropology. So this is a very exciting and interesting novelty in the anthropological panorama in Brazil. So we do have this group of people, and they come from their peoples, most of them in the Amazon, and they got their PhDs in anthropology. And again, that was, of course, was part of the result of programs of extending the right to education to these individuals. But then one thing that we quickly see in their publications is a very strong attack against anthropology, accusing anthropology of being a colonial practice, right? And that caught a lot of a good part of the Brazilian anthropological universe by surprise. So one thing I would like to discuss is, and it is connected to both Professor Tim's and Maggie's presentation, is what is this accusation and what we can do about it. So I'll go back to Professor Ingold's talk yesterday and his definition of anthropology. Generosity, open-endedness, comparative, critical, directed to the future. His mention that participant observation is an ontological commitment as part of the commoning of the future and of reality. And a very interesting term he uses for this is ontogenesis. In a different talk, he used the Deleuzian terms, interstitial differentiation, disjunctive synthesis. But then at some point yesterday, he said, we have reached an epochal moment where the Enlightenment has crumbled or is crumbling. And therefore, fundamentalisms are rising. And this is where I would like to start my argument. So the crumbling of the Enlightenment not only brings with it an enormous amount of very serious dangers, but it also brings an enormous amount of very interesting opportunities for thinking differently. Right? So would you? I found this 2 days ago in The Guardian. So this debate about decolonizing knowledge is happening in a very interesting way in England. So you have the London School of Oriental and Asian Studies. There's a huge debate about what to do with philosophers that are white men. So there is the post-colonial movement that left an important mark in the thinking of Latin America. Then there is the decolonization movement, and we have very, very important authors like Escobar, Mignolo, Quijano, Dusso. And I have to say that this movement is much stronger in the Spanish-speaking Latin America than in Brazil. Right? And we can, of course, discuss why. But in Brazil, there is this novelty that is the theory of Amerindian perspectivism proposed by Eduardo Oliveira de Castro. And a critical and important moment in the history of this theory was Eduardo's stay in Cambridge in 1998 and lectures that he delivered in Cambridge. So there's this connection with England. And one of the things that Eduardo says is the goal of anthropology, this is a different definition of what anthropology is or should be. The goal of anthropology is to help promote the ontological self-determination of peoples. And in a recent meeting of the American Anthropological Association, he also said that he was not referring only to human peoples. So yesterday, in my comment to Professor Ingold, I said, so that we all agree, I hope, I certainly agree with everything he said. Now the problem is in the nuts and bolts of how to make it exist, right? The common process. And in particular in the context of this program, we are going to collaborate with each other, right? This is the goal of this workshop. But then, what are the rules of engagement for this collaboration? This is something I would like to discuss. So there are two questions that I would like to discuss. One is about epistemological practices in the context of a process of decolonizing anthropology. And the second thing is about ontological assumptions. And of course they are strongly connected to each other, but I'll discuss them separately, just for didactic reasons. Right? So in what regard epistemological practices, I have grown unsatisfied with the way the most important rituals in international anthropology take place, and I'm referring to the annual meetings of the American Anthropological Association, the biannual meetings of the European Association for Social Anthropologists, the meetings of the anthropology of the Mercosur, right, the RAMS, and in Brazil is the RBA. And these meetings are characterized by what I call a soft cosmopolitanism that makes everything commensurable with anything else. So what I'm saying here is that you go to these meetings, you have 15 minutes to talk about your research in a long stream of hundreds, perhaps thousands of such presentations. Clarity is required. You cannot be obscure. If you cite too much French philosophy, particularly the AAA meetings, you will be accused of being annoyingly and intentionally obscure. And it's seen as completely inappropriate. So what exactly is being produced in these rituals? So the philosophy of language that is behind the whole thing, and it's painful to say, is naturalistic, is denotational. It assumes language is transparent, and anything in the universe is reducible to language description. So, of course, it is a residue of the positivistic project. And, of course, it has been criticized over and over and over again in philosophy, in linguistics, in anthropology, but we keep using it. And we keep teaching our students to do it if they want to get a job. So one thing about such practices is that it raises difference and it enables easy collaboration. So imagine if we plan here to write papers and present them in conferences, it's going to be pretty easy, right? If we assume this soft cosmopolitanism approach. Now, what's the alternative? Well, it has been discussed over and over again that language is performative, and it's part of the ontogenesis or the commoning, as Professor Ingold mentioned, right? And I'll give you a very interesting example, and I'll pass very quickly from one point to the other. It's just like a series of provocations for us to discuss later on. So here, there is a very interesting example of the use of this performative dimension of language in ways that are not denotational, descriptive, naturalistic. So this is a book published by Davi Kopenawa. He's a Yanomami shaman from the Amazon with a French anthropologist called Bruce Albert. It's a long conversation between the shaman and the anthropologist. But it's in the first person of the shaman. Right? And Eduardo Viveiros de Castro was invited to write a preface for the Brazilian edition. And in the preface, he says something very interesting, not with these words, but the thing is, why on earth would a Yanomami shaman want to write a book? Well, they don't have books. And of course, the intention of the book was not to explain to us how the Yanomami word exists. Right? So it's kind of our self-indulgent idea that everyone in the planet have to explain themselves to us. Right? This is also a problem in anthropology. Now, we have to explain the others, and they have to explain themselves to us. And if you were being too obscure with French philosophy, that's a problem. But so the thing here is what Eduardo puts in the preface is, of course, that's not the case. It's a 1,000-page book. There's not one reference to female infanticide, which is something that the Yanomami is often accused of. Right? So it's not about describing the Yanomami universe. It is what Eduardo puts as, this is a shamanistic treatment of the whites that are so attached to books. So what Schopenhauer realized is that the civilization of the whites is a suicidal civilization, but it's so strong that it can drag everyone else on the planet with it to suicide. So he needed to do something about it, and one idea is he needed to treat shamanically the whites. Now the whites they have this fetish about books, so he decided to publish a book in order to do that. So this is a wonderful example of the use of the performative power of language. And if you read the book, it's fantastic. It's one of the most spectacular pieces of ethnographic writing I ever read in my life. Now, the other thing related to that is that a great amount of the world and of the human experience of the world is not reducible to language. So there are things, and there are very important things, that cannot be expressed through words. So, and there are things that will take much more than 12 months of field work for you to experience. And when you do, you won't be able to describe it in any satisfactory way. And of course, I'm talking common sense for most of you, right? Except that in our writing exercises, we use genres of communication that assume that the world is perfectly describable and language is transparent. So I think this is much more important in the crafting of a common future, of the commoning, as Professor Engel put yesterday, than our publish or perish rituals. So one of the things about decolonization is, how do we get out of this trap? And this soft cosmopolitanism of international conferences is deeply problematic. Of course, it is a form of epistemological colonialism, maybe like a neo-colonialism, of course. So in terms of rules of engagement, if we will not rely on this soft cosmopolitanism, we should be ready for the fact that our interaction has the potential for destabilizing, ontologically speaking, each other. This is the key point I want to make. If we are not going to pretend everything is fine from the beginning, we will probably say things that will disturb each other, ontologically speaking. And then I go to my second point, which is related to ontological assumptions. And I'll start by saying that Uruguay is arguably the most Europeanized of all countries in Latin America. It was very efficient in its genocide against the indigenous population. But São Paulo is one of the most Europeanized states in Brazil. And on top of that, if you look around in this room, you see that with one or two exceptions, the absolute majority of individuals here are white middle class. Okay, so cooperation will be easy, right? Of course, all these identity labels are misleading, and I don't have to explain why. There are decades of criticism against social theories based on identity. Now, what I want to get here is when I start reading the criticism of the indigenous anthropologists in Brazil, something very quickly came to my mind, and it is, well, who exactly are indigenous in Brazil? And if we look at, let's say that yesterday when the objects were presented, 4 of the Brazilians that brought objects brought things that in anthropological theory would be called fetishes, right? So objects that offer spiritual protection. And that was not any theater or any play. So when you think about Brazil, a lot of people that could be considered indigenous because of the way they perceive and live reality may be white-skinned and may be descendants of Europeans. So I realized that I had a number of friends. I myself was raised in a family whose cultural tradition was deeply animistic. And then the majority or all of the Afro-Brazilian religious traditions are strongly animistic. And you have a very considerable amount of the population in Brazil that are connected to these religious traditions, including in anthropology. So one of the things I realized that I had friends that when they got into the university, they acted as if they were French individuals. It was a big theater. When they got out of the university, they went to the religious, center of practice, right? And then of course, we all know that we have multiple identities and we react to the context and so on. So the question here is why the Brazilian university has to be a theater where we pretend we are French or English or American in the way we perceive and live ontologically the world, right? So what I'm saying here is so animism in Brazil is a serious issue, which defies the automatic practice of deconstructing all forms of exotic cultural practices over a naturalistic platform. And when I say animism, what am I talking about? Professor Ingold has so many brilliant papers on animism, and he really dislikes the way Philippe Descola classifies it. I am in total agreement with Professor Ingold in his theoretical work on animism, but I have to say that Descola's way of talking about animism has ethnographic value in Brazil. So there is a number of religious traditions that understand reality in the way that Descola describes animism, right? So I'll give an example of my current research. I have been doing research with geoengineering, but a very peculiar form of it, which I call outer geoengineering. So after realizing that these are the main schemes of geoengineering. The idea of geoengineering is putting in place very large technological schemes in order to be able to control the chemical composition of the atmosphere or of the oceans or both of them, in order to control the amount of radiation coming from the sun that reaches the ground, right? And it, of course, generates panic in anyone who thinks properly. Because if it goes wrong, the risk of producing a catastrophe that adds to climate change is enormous. But then I realized that there's an enormous amount of non-Western populations around the planet to whom manipulating the atmosphere is not a problem. They have been doing it for thousands of years, and it's more than that. if they don't do it, the atmosphere doesn't work. I mean, the Yanomamo is one example. So in that book that I have shown, D'Amico Penawa explains in an unprecedented amount of detail how the Yanomamo shamans interact all the time with the atmosphere through shamanistic rituals. And the idea is that if they don't do it, the skies will fall. So they have to keep doing it in order to keep the universe functioning, right? So I call that alter geoengineering, and I try to compare different forms of doing it to see what's the problem with this, right? How come we get to this crazy suicidal point of thinking about geoengineering, and how other people think and do it, right? And then there are two case studies that I would like to present to you. One is about a 1998 wildfire in the state of Roraima. Roraima is in the northern part of Brazil, border with Venezuela. And in 1998, there was a huge wildfire. The majority of the state was in flames. The Brazilian government could not control it. They had to ask for help from the UN, and Venezuela sent some helicopters, and Argentina sent helicopters, and nothing was successful in dealing with the fire. And then someone from the Brazilian Foundation for Indigenous Affairs took two indigenous shamans from a different ethnicity, from Pará, the state of Pará, and flew them into Roraima and took them to the forest. And they entered the woods, and they did a shamanistic ritual for 2 days. They got out of the woods, and they said, let's get out of here because it's going to rain a lot. And it rained so much that 95% of the fire was extinguished. Okay, that's not the interesting point. It happens all the time. The interesting point is that the Brazilian Senate decided to form a commission to study the case. So this commission was formed by the senators and some technicians. They went to Roraima, and they did a number of public hearings in order to understand what happened. And they went back to Brasilia, and they produced this report. And this report is in the library of the Brazilian Congress. And this report says exactly that. So the thing was totally out of control, and then two shamans were brought in, and they did this ritual, and they came out, and it rained a lot, and it extinguished without square quotes, no quotes in the Brazilian report. And I'm talking about the Congress, I mean, where you have an enormous amount of lawyers. They know that the way they put the signals in language has the juridical implications. So there's no quotes in this report. It is online too. So that was fascinating. A second case is this is the report, right? So I'm not going to. No, the other way around. The second case is a research I'm developing for some time now. And it's about a foundation called Coral Snake Chief Foundation. It's an institution associated with the Brazilian religious tradition of Umbanda. And they claim that they can change the conditions of the atmosphere through religious rituals. And once again, that's nothing special. What's interesting about this case is that they provide services to very visible, important clients in Brazil, like the municipal government of the city of Rio de Janeiro, the municipal government of the city of São Paulo. So I'm talking about the two largest, richest, and most sophisticated cities in the country. And they also provide service to a company called Furnas, which is part of the Ministry of Mines and Energy. And they produce hydropower, so they are interested in rains. And besides the clients that come from the public government, they also have private clients like, these are the contracts that they do exist, and they were published in the in Brazil. So another very visible client is the company that produces Rockin Rio. So Rockin Rio is a musical concert, has been going on for many, many years now, and they have editions in Rio, in Lisbon, in Spain. There was one edition in Las Vegas. And since, I think, 2001, they hired the Coral Snake Chief Foundation, so they make the weather dry without rains during the concerts. What happens, the municipal government of Rio de Janeiro hires them for producing dry weather during the firework spectacle of the New Year's Eve in the Copacabana beach, which is one of the most famous firework festivals in the world, right? And the institution claims, I could not verify this, but the institution claims that in 1987 in England there was a cold spell that was so intense. I think the temperature was like 10 degrees under minus Celsius, and someone called them, and in 24 hours the temperature went above zero or something, and there is something in the Guardian talking about it. But as I said, this was given to me by the institution. I haven't checked. Now, another connection to England is that in the 2012 Olympic Games, there were news articles in Brazil saying that these people were called in order to make produce a dry weather over the Olympic Stadium where the opening ceremony would take place. And then the article says that, well, how does it happen? So it is a religious institution. There is a woman who incorporates the spirit of the Coral Snake Chief, and then the spirit has an army of other spirits that work in controlling the conditions of the weather. So this woman stayed in Dublin, and humidity that was coming from the ocean was deviated to Spain or something like this. So it's described in this. And this is a very respected journalist in Brazil. If you were Brazilian, you will recognize him. He's a celebrity guy in Brazil. One more. And now there is one particular interesting case here, and that is the Brazilian Association of Metrologists. They sued this institution for the illegal practice of metrology. And then, so there is a CREA. CREA is the institution in Brazil that regulates the work of engineers, agronomers, and metrologists. So if you're a metrologist, you have to have your registration at CREA. So there was a complaint at CREA that these crazy guys are doing, metrology without a proper. Well, now the fascinating part of it is that CREA assigned some of its members to analyze and judge the case, and the guy gave it to the institution. So this is the report that he produced, and what he says in the report is, metrology is about science, and what these people do is about religion, and the two things have nothing to do with each other. Therefore, we have nothing to do with that. And then he puts a very interesting paragraph where he says, despite of the fact that all these things do exist, they are part of nature. And he gives an example of medicine in which there's a number of forms of treatments that were discriminated against for being non-scientific in the past, and now they are part of the medical institution. So he said, well, probably it will happen with metrology, but not at this point. So I suggest the case is filed And the case was filed. So this formal official declaration that ontologically speaking, these things do exist, but they are not of our professional concern, is really fascinating, right? And of course, there was a lot of media coverage of all these things. Okay, so what to do with all this? So there are some analytical possibilities here, right? I can do like a hermeneutic analysis, a symbolic analysis in a Goethean tradition. I can talk about fetishism, alienation, false consciousness. I can talk about biopower, governmentality. I can, talk about bring theories from social psychology and evoke psychoanalysis. And in doing that, what would I be doing? I would be dissolving reality away. Right? So one of the problems in a situation like this is that very often anthropological theory is evoked to neutralize ontological difference. From someone that came from an animistic background like myself, there's nothing to be explained. Nothing. Right? So there's no need to neutralize this reality. Perhaps there are other things to be explained. How politicians deal with the amount of ambiguity and conflict in putting their names in a contract with this institution. But not the existence of, or not, of these beings that are part of reality, despite of the fact that Western mainstream science keeps them out. Right? I'm going to give you another quick example. No, it's here. No, one back. Again, Davi Copenau. He was in the National Museum in Rio de Janeiro in an event with anthropologist Roy Wagner. It's a very interesting event in Rio. And he said something that was fascinating. He said that the Amazonian shamans are very concerned about climate change for a long time. I mean, they have been noticing the changes in the vegetation and the animals in the sky and so on. And they have been working on it for a long time now, shamanistically. And then there comes what's fascinating. What he said is, whatever the equipments of the white people can detect and notice is only what we could not mitigate through shamanism. Do you understand what I'm saying? Well, my metrologist friends, they get enraged when I say that. So what he's saying is, we have done a lot, and you cannot see it because we fixed it. So whatever you can see is only what we could not fix through your equipment and so on. So it's a kind of a reversal of an ontological hierarchy, right? And again, what to do with that? There's nothing we can do with that, actually. And why do we feel that he must be wrong? And we have to find a way of proving him wrong. Okay, so what I'm saying here is we are different. I don't know who this we are, but we are different. And I believe that all this that I mentioned exists more intensely in Brazil. So I may have shocked my Uruguayan colleagues here today. But it is my perception that this is an interesting starting point for our collaboration and also for how we construct the process of commoning. And that is now our challenge. Thank you.